There is a moment, most parents will tell you, that never fully leaves them. Not the birthday parties, or the first steps, or the photographs tucked into wallets. The moment that stays, the one that brands itself into the marrow, is the last time they saw their child's face. For Claire Bennett, that moment happened inside a flooded hallway in the summer of 1992 in a hospital that was coming apart at the seams during a storm that swallowed the Gulf Coast whole. 1 second, Grace was there, small fingers wrapped around Claire's wrist, brown eyes wide and frightened. And then the lights went out, the water came up, and Grace was gone. Gone in the dark. Gone in the flood, gone in the kind of chaos that swallows everything and returns almost nothing. For 12 years, Claire Bennett lived with the official answer: Grace did not survive. The search teams had combed what they could reach, the water had been too high, too fast, and a 4-year-old child alone in all of that did not have odds worth calculating. The death certificate arrived. The caseworkers closed the file. The state of Louisiana moved on, the way states do after disasters, burying the losses under mountains of paperwork and the relentless machinery of recovery. Claire did not move on. Claire could not. And then, on a Thursday afternoon in the spring of 2004, she stepped into an elevator in Mobile, Alabama, and heard something that made the entire world stop. A teenager's voice, barely above a whisper, counting backward. 10, 9, 8. 3 words, a private ritual, a thing Claire had taught her daughter in a pediatric exam room when Grace was 3 years old and terrified of needles. If you're scared, sweetheart, you count backwards from 10. 7, 6, 5. Claire turned around slowly. The girl standing in the corner of that elevator was 16 years old, dark-haired, hugging her own arms the way nervous kids do. She wasn't looking at Claire, she was looking at the elevator doors, lips moving softly. 4, 3, 2, 1. The doors opened, the girl stepped out, and Claire Bennett stood frozen in that elevator for a very long time, unable to move, unable to breathe, feeling something enormous and terrible and hopeful crack open inside her. In this video, we're going to walk through what we know about the disappearance of Grace Bennett on August 24, 1992, the 12 years of silence that followed, and the extraordinary chain of events that began in a Mobile, Alabama apartment building in the spring of 2004. This is a story about a storm, a hospital, a grieving woman, and a girl who was raised under a name that was never hers. It is a story about what gets lost in disasters and what, against every reasonable expectation, sometimes finds its way back. Before we go any further, if you're new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one, and this is a story that deserves to be told carefully and completely. Stay with us, we're just getting started. To understand what happened to Grace Bennett on August 24, 1992, you have to go back to the summer of 1992, to the Louisiana coast, and to a Category 5 hurricane that was already being called one of the most powerful storms to ever make landfall in the continental United States. Hurricane Andrew came ashore in the early morning hours of August 24, 1992. It had spent days building strength over the warm waters of the Gulf, and by the time it turned toward the Louisiana coast, meteorologists were running out of superlatives. Wind speeds that exceeded anything in living memory for most of the residents in its path. A storm surge that would push seawater miles inland. Communities that had been there for generations reduced in a matter of hours to debris fields. The evacuation orders had gone out days before. Most people got out, but hospitals don't evacuate easily. Patients on ventilators, patients in surgical recovery, patients who cannot be moved without risk of dying from the very act of movement. These people and the staff who care for them stay behind in reinforced buildings and hope that the structure holds and that the backup generators keep running and that the water doesn't rise too fast. Claire Bennett was 29 years old that August. She had come into Slidell General Hospital 4 days earlier for an emergency appendectomy, and she was still in recovery when the evacuation orders came down. She was not in any condition to be transported, and she was told she wouldn't be. The hospital was rated to withstand a Category 3. The staff was prepared. The upper floors would be safe. She had not planned on bringing Grace to the hospital with her. Grace was 4 years old, small and bright-eyed, and obsessed at that particular moment in her life with a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Buttons. Claire's mother had been watching Grace during the surgery, but when the storm's track shifted and the evacuation orders expanded, Claire's mother had her own house to secure, her own elderly neighbors to check in on, and the plan changed the way plans always change in the hours before a major storm. Grace came to the hospital. Claire would recover, they would shelter together, and when the storm passed, they would go home. That was the plan. The storm did not cooperate with the plan. Andrew hit the Slidell area with a fury that exceeded what the hospital's engineers had modeled. The backup generators failed. Flooding came faster than anyone had anticipated, water pouring into the lower floors and then, with terrifying speed, beginning to climb toward the second floor where the recovery ward was located. The decision was made to move patients upward, to the third and fourth floors, which were still dry. It was the right call. It was also chaotic in a way that is almost impossible to describe from the outside looking in. Claire has spoken in the years since about what those hours felt like. She was still weak from surgery, moving on legs that didn't want to hold her weight, carrying Grace on her hip because the hallway was crowded with stretchers and wheelchairs and staff and other patients, and the water was already ankle-deep at the stairwell entrance. She had Grace. She had a firm grip on Grace. And then someone in the crowd surged against her, another patient or a family member or a staff member in a hurry, she never knew which, and in the press of bodies and the darkness and the noise of the storm crashing through the building, her grip slipped. She reached back immediately. The space where Grace had been was filled with other bodies, other arms, strangers pushing forward toward the stairs. Claire called Grace's name. She kept calling it. She tried to push backward against the crowd, and the crowd would not let her. Other hands pulled her forward, toward the stairs, toward the upper floor, and she fought them. She fought every one of them, screaming her daughter's name into the noise of the storm. The official record reflects that Grace Bennett, age 4, was last seen by her mother in the second-floor corridor of Slidell General Hospital at approximately 11:20 in the evening on August 24, 1992. What happened in the hours after that is where the record becomes incomplete. The hospital was not fully accessible to search teams until nearly 72 hours later, after the water receded enough to allow entry. By then, the building had been through the worst of it, and what the search teams found when they went through the lower floors was not something that offered much hope for a small child who had been alone in all of that. There were no signs of Grace. No sign that she had reached the upper floors on her own. No sign that any of the staff recalled seeing her after Claire was separated from her. Searchers expanded outward into the surrounding area as soon as conditions allowed. Louisiana in late August 1992, in the immediate aftermath of Andrew, was not a landscape that gave up its secrets easily. There was water everywhere. There was debris everywhere. There were hundreds of missing persons reports flooding into overwhelmed county and state offices, and the resources to investigate them were stretched thin beyond any reasonable expectation of adequacy. Grace Bennett's file remained open for 11 months. In July of 1993, with the investigation effectively stalled and no new leads having surfaced in many months, Louisiana state officials made the determination that was recorded in the documents. Grace Bennett, date of birth April 3, 1988, was presumed deceased. The circumstances of the hurricane and the flooding of Slidell General Hospital were consistent with the conclusion that a 4-year-old child separated from her family in those conditions could not have survived. Claire received the paperwork at her apartment in Baton Rouge. She read it once, she put it in the drawer, she did not accept it. She would tell people later that she didn't know how to explain the certainty she felt, only that it was there. A mother's instinct is not a legal instrument. It carries no weight in a courtroom, but it is for the person who carries it as real as anything on paper. Claire Bennett knew, in the way that she knew her own heartbeat, that Grace was alive. She simply did not know where to look, or how to look, or what she was actually looking for. And so the years passed. Claire rebuilt her life in pieces. She moved to Mobile in 1998, drawn there by a job, by the desire for a fresh start in a city that didn't hold the specific weight of the Louisiana coast. She made a life there. She built something that looked from the outside like a woman who had survived something terrible and come through the other side. On the inside, she never stopped watching. She never stopped looking at girls in grocery stores and playgrounds and school hallways and thinking about the shape of a 4-year-old face and how it might grow. She kept a photograph of Grace on her nightstand. Brown eyes, a gap-toothed smile, Mr. Buttons tucked under one small arm. She had been living in the Harbor View apartment complex on the west side of Mobile for about 3 years by the spring of 2004. It was a quiet building, mostly families, a few retirees, the kind of place where people nodded at each other in the parking lot and knew the names of their neighbors' dogs. Claire had lived in apartment 5B long enough to know most of the faces in the building, and she knew that apartment 3C was occupied by a woman named Margaret Reed and her teenage daughter. She had seen them in passing. The girl was quiet, a little shy, the kind of teenager who kept her head down and moved through spaces without taking up much room. Margaret was polite, careful, the kind of neighbor who smiled when she had to and otherwise kept to herself. Claire had never had a reason to think about them beyond that, until the elevator. That afternoon, April 17, 2004, Claire had been returning from a grocery run, her hands full of bags, when she stepped into the elevator on the ground floor at the same moment as the girl from 3C. She didn't know the girl's name yet. She only knew the face, vaguely, the way you know a face from a building you've lived in for years. The elevator had a tendency to shudder between floors, an old building thing, a mechanical hiccup that happened often enough that most residents had stopped noticing it. But the girl noticed it. The moment the elevator doors closed, Claire saw the girl's jaw tighten, saw her grip the strap of her bag, and then, almost inaudible, she heard it. 10, 9, 8. Claire's grocery bags hit the floor. The girl looked at her, brown eyes, a face that was 16 years old, and a face that Claire's memory rearranged in an instant into something that had been 4 years old in a dark hospital hallway. 7, 6. Claire said nothing. She barely breathed. The elevator reached the 3rd floor. The girl stepped out without looking back, and Claire stood in that elevator for a long moment after the doors closed again, her groceries scattered at her feet, her hands shaking. That counting down method was not something Claire had read in a parenting book. It was not a technique she had heard somewhere and adopted. It was something she had invented on the spot in a pediatric clinic waiting room when Grace had worked herself into a full panic about the flu shot she was about to receive. Claire had held both of Grace's small hands in hers and said softly, "If you're scared, you count backwards from 10. It feels like you're counting the fear down. It feels like it gets smaller with every number." Grace had used it in the clinic that day. She had used it the following week when Claire trimmed her fingernails, which Grace inexplicably hated with every fiber of her small being. She had used it on the morning of August 24, 1992, in the hospital, when Claire had tried to prepare her for what was coming. It was a private thing, a small, particular, personal thing between a mother and her daughter. Not a phrase you would pick up from a friend, not something that drifts through the cultural atmosphere and gets absorbed unconsciously. A specific sequence of words delivered in a specific context that Claire had invented and Grace had internalized. And now, a 16-year-old girl in an apartment building in Mobile, Alabama, was using it. Claire spent that night sitting at her kitchen table, trying to apply the cold logic of reason to what her heart was already doing. She was aware of the dangers of this. She had spent 12 years watching her own grief for patterns, catching herself seeing Grace's face in strangers, forcing herself back to reality with the grim efficiency of someone who has been through that particular heartbreak enough times to recognize it. She knew that grief is an engine of projection. She knew that a mother who has lost a child will find that child in faces that do not belong to her. But this was not a face. This was a behavior, a learned behavior, a specific invented coping mechanism that no one else in the world had any reason to know except the child Claire had taught it. By morning, she had made a list. She wrote down every piece of information she could reasonably observe or access without crossing any lines. She wrote down the apartment number, 3C. She wrote down the woman's name, which she had seen on the mailbox downstairs, M. Reed. She wrote down the girl's approximate age, 16. She wrote down the date, April 17, 2004. She wrote down what she had heard and exactly how she had heard it. And then she began to think about what she actually knew about the girl downstairs, which was, she realized, almost nothing. Over the next several weeks, Claire moved carefully. She was not a reckless person. She was not someone who had spent 12 years being consumed by this and now was about to explode it all over a stranger based on one piece of evidence, however compelling. She understood that she needed more. She understood that if she was wrong, her behavior could hurt this girl. And she understood that if she was right and she moved too fast, she could cause everything to fall apart before it could be confirmed. She started with what was available to anyone paying attention. She listened in the laundry room. She paid attention to mail and packages in the lobby. She noted the details of conversations she had with other neighbors who had lived there longer than she had. What she found was thin, but it was consistent in a way that troubled her. None of the long-term residents of Harborview could recall seeing Margaret Reed before late 2002. Not a single person who had lived there for more than 2 years could place her arrival earlier than that. The building manager, an older man named Dennis who had been running the property since the mid-90s, had no record of a previous address for Margaret beyond a post office box in Mississippi that has since been closed. Margaret paid in cash for her first several months. She had not enrolled the girl in local schools until the fall of 2002, which would have been, if the girl were roughly 16 now, about 2 years later than a typical school enrollment age. None of this was evidence. All of it was strange. Claire found one more thing, and this one she stumbled into without intending to. She was in the elevator again, a few weeks after that first afternoon, when she came face to face with the girl alone for the second time. The girl smiled, a careful, polite smile, the kind of smile teenagers give to adults they don't know but are trying to be civil to. Claire smiled back. She asked, gently, what grade the girl was in. The girl said she was finishing 10th grade. Claire said, "Oh, and where did you go to school before here?" And the girl's smile did something complicated. It didn't fall, it adjusted. The way a smile adjusts when someone has been trained to handle a question without showing that the question is difficult. She said, "Oh, we moved around a lot." Claire nodded. She said, "That must have been hard, all that moving." And the girl said, quietly, "Yeah, sometimes." And then the elevator reached the 3rd floor, and the girl was gone again. Moving around a lot. No fixed history before 2002. Cash payments. A girl who flinched at an elevator and counted down from 10. On May 28, 2004, Claire Bennett walked into the mobile police department and asked to speak to a detective. The detective assigned to take her statement was Sarah Torres, a 12-veteran year of the department who had spent the last 4 years working missing persons cases. Torres was, by every account, a careful investigator. She was not the kind of detective who dismissed civilians. She was also not the kind of detective who ran down every lead brought in by grieving parents who had spent years looking for lost children in the faces of strangers. She listened to Claire's statement fully. She took notes. She asked questions that were precise and professional. And when Claire had finished, Torres sat quietly for a moment. Then she said something that Claire would remember for a long time. She said, "I hear what you're saying, and I want you to know I'm not dismissing it, but I also want you to understand that you've been through an enormous amount, and grief does things to our pattern recognition that aren't always accurate. What you've described is one behavioral similarity. It could be explained in a lot of different ways." Claire said she understood. She said she wasn't asking Torres to arrest anyone. She was asking Torres to look, just to look. Torres agreed to look. What happened next took several months, the slow, careful work of a department with limited resources and no active case. An investigator running a preliminary inquiry that had not yet reached the level of official investigation. Torres ran the name Margaret Reed through available state and federal databases. She found a Margaret Ann Reed in Mississippi, born 1958, with a daughter named Emily Catherine Reed, born April 3, 1988, in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Emily Catherine Reed. Claire's daughter Grace had been born on April 3, 1988. Torres noted the matching birth date and ran further. What she found when she dug into Emily Reed's records was a medical file that ended in August 1992. Emily Reed had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia in early 1992 at the age of 4. She had been treated at a hospital in Hattiesburg. The records showed deteriorating condition through the spring and summer of that year, and then in August 1992, the records simply stopped. No discharge record, no transfer record, no death certificate on file. Torres filed a formal records request with the state of Mississippi. It took 6 weeks to come back. When it did, it contained a death certificate for Margaret Catherine Reed, dated August 24, 1992. Cause of death: complications of acute lymphoblastic leukemia. August 24, 1992. The same day Hurricane Andrew made landfall. The same day Grace Bennett disappeared from Slidell General Hospital. Sarah Torres sat with that document for a long time, and then she picked up her phone and called Claire Bennett. She said, "I think we need to talk." The meeting happened on a Tuesday morning in October of 2004 in a conference room at the Mobile Police Department that smelled like old coffee and printer toner. Claire sat on one side of the table. Torres sat across from her with a manila folder and a legal pad. Between them, laid out in a careful row, were photocopies of documents that told a story neither of them had fully assembled yet, but that both of them could feel taking shape. Torres walked Claire through what she had found: the birth record for Emily Catherine Reed, April 3, 1988, Hattiesburg, Mississippi. The leukemia diagnosis, early 1992, the deteriorating medical record through that spring and summer. And then the death certificate, dated August 24, 1992, the night of the storm, the night Grace disappeared, 60 miles away across the state line. Claire listened without speaking. She had learned over 12 years of waiting how to hold very still when something enormous was happening. Torres said, "What I can tell you right now is that the chronology is unusual. A child dies on August 24, 1992. That same night, 40 miles away, another child of the same age and the same birthday goes missing in a hospital evacuation. And 12 years later, a 16-year-old girl is living under a name that belonged to a child who died, with a woman who has no verifiable history prior to late 2002. Claire said, "You believe me?" Torres said, "I believe the timeline is worth investigating seriously. That's what I can tell you right now." What Torres did not say, and what Claire understood without being told, was that believing the timeline and having enough to compel a DNA test were two very different things. The law in Alabama in 2004 was clear. You could not compel a juvenile to submit to genetic testing based on circumstantial evidence and a mother's intuition, however well documented. You needed more. You needed something that would satisfy a judge, that would demonstrate probable cause, that the potential disruption to a minor's life was justified by the weight of the evidence. Torres needed more, and getting more without tipping her hand to Margaret Reed was going to require patience. She told Claire to go home. She told her not to approach the girl or Margaret again. She told her not to discuss what she knew with anyone in the building, not to let on that she had been to the police, not to change her behavior in any way that would signal to Margaret that something was moving. She said, "I know every instinct you have is telling you to go knock on that door, but if you do that, and Margaret takes that girl and runs, we may not get another chance." Claire went home. She sat on her kitchen floor, back against the refrigerator, and breathed. The investigation Torres ran over the following weeks was quiet in the way that good investigative work has to be. She went back to Mississippi state records and requested everything available under the name Margaret Reed between 1990 and 2004. She contacted the Hattiesburg Hospital where Emily Reed had been treated and requested the complete file under a formal law enforcement inquiry. She reached out to a contact at the Louisiana Department of Health and asked for everything related to the Slidell General Hospital evacuation of August 24, 1992, specifically any records related to unaccompanied minors. That last request was the one that mattered most. It took 3 weeks. The Louisiana records from that period were not in good shape. The storm had damaged county infrastructure across the region, and what survived was not always easy to navigate. But buried in a box of documents from the post-Andrew emergency management files, Torres's contact found something. A handwritten log entry dated August 27, 1992, from a Red Cross emergency shelter in Picayune, Mississippi, approximately 40 miles from Slidell. The log recorded the arrival of a woman and a small child, described as a girl approximately 4 years old, dark hair, brown eyes. The woman had given her name as Margaret Reed. The child had been logged as Emily Reed, age 4. The log noted that the child had no identification and that the woman stated the child's documents had been lost in the flooding. A 4-year-old girl with no documents in the custody of a woman who had just lost her own 4-year-old daughter at a Red Cross shelter 3 days after the hurricane. Torres read that entry 4 times. She made a copy. She put it in the folder. And then she sat back and thought about what she was actually looking at. Margaret Reed had not grabbed a stranger's child and disappeared in the calculated way the word kidnapping tends to imply. The picture forming was more complicated than that, more human, more heartbreaking in a way that made it harder to examine cleanly. Emily had died on the night of August 24th in a Hattiesburg hospital of a disease that had been killing her slowly through all that winter and spring and summer. She had been in that hospital when the storm came. She had been holding Emily's hand when the machine stopped, and then she was alone in a building being evacuated around her, with a dead child and a grief that is by any measure the kind that unmakes a person. And somehow, in the hours or days that followed, she had found grace. Torres thought about that a lot. About what that moment must have looked like. A small child, alone, the same age as the daughter just lost. Margaret had not planned it. The logic, if there was logic, was not the logic of a predator. It was the logic of a broken person reaching for something to hold on to in the dark. That was what made it so difficult to look at cleanly. And that was also, Torres reminded herself, not her judgment to make. The law did not have a category for grief as permission. A child had been taken from her mother. A child had been raised under a dead girl's name. Whatever the circumstances, those were the facts. She had enough to move forward. On November 14, 2004, Sarah Torres applied for a court order compelling DNA testing of the minor known as Caitlin Margaret Reed, currently residing at the Harbor View apartment complex in Mobile, Alabama. The application included the Red Cross shelter log, the Mississippi death certificate for Emily Catherine Reed, the Louisiana missing persons file for Grace Marie Bennett, the matching birth dates, the absence of pre-2002 verifiable records, and a summary of the investigative steps taken over the preceding months. The judge reviewed the application for 4 days. On November 18, 2004, the order was granted. What happened next moved faster than anything in the preceding months and slower at the same time than Claire Bennett could tolerate. A court date was set. A child services representative was appointed. Margaret Reed was notified that she would need to bring Caitlin to a designated facility for the testing. Torres told Claire by phone that the order had been granted. Claire was sitting in her car in a grocery store parking lot when the call came. She sat there for a long time after she hung up, watching people come and go with their carts, ordinary people doing ordinary things on an ordinary Tuesday, while the world she had lived in for 12 years tilted slowly on its axis. The DNA testing was conducted on November 22, 2004, at a certified facility in Mobile, Alabama. Caitlin came in with Margaret. They sat in the waiting area with a child services representative, and the process was kept as undisruptive as possible for a 16-year-old girl who had been told only that there was a legal matter requiring a simple medical procedure. Claire was not there. Torres had advised strongly against it, and Claire had agreed, because whatever this girl was or wasn't, she was a teenager who deserved to not have a stranger looking at her like she was the answer to a 12-year prayer. The samples were collected. The chain of custody was logged. The samples were sent to the State Forensic Lab in Montgomery. Standard processing time was 4 to 6 weeks. Torres told Claire, "It will be before the end of the year." Claire asked, "And if it comes back positive?" Torres said, "Then we have a confirmed identification and we move to the next step." Claire asked, "What is the next step?" Torres looked at her for a moment, and in that moment, Claire understood that the next step was the part nobody had fully mapped yet. Because the next step involved a 16-year-old girl who had no memory of a life before Margaret Reed, who had been raised under a stolen name, and who was about to have her entire identity restructured by a piece of paper in a government envelope. The results came back on December 19, 2004. Torres called Claire at 7:43 in the morning. Claire had not slept. She had been awake since 4, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea gone cold, watching the light change outside the window. Torres said, "The DNA is a match. The probability of biological relationship is 99.998%. Caitlin Reed is your daughter." Claire set the phone down on the kitchen table. She pressed both hands flat against the wood. Outside, Mobile was doing what December mornings do in Alabama. Pale light, cool air, the city waking up slowly, indifferent to the fact that something enormous had just happened in a kitchen on the west side. Grace Bennett had been missing since August 24, 1992. She had been found, 12 years and 4 months later, living 3 floors below the mother who had never stopped looking for her. The days that followed the DNA confirmation were a controlled explosion of legal process and careful coordination. There were jurisdictional questions, given that the original disappearance had occurred in Louisiana and the recovery was happening in Alabama. There were lawyers, there were hearings, there were people on both sides of the situation who needed to be protected by different parts of the same legal system simultaneously. Margaret Reed was brought in for formal questioning on December 21, 2004. Torres conducted the interview herself. She had interviewed a lot of people in 12 years of law enforcement, and she had developed a fairly reliable instinct for what she was going to find when she sat down across from someone. She expected Margaret to be defensive, perhaps calculating, running through possible exits in real time. She was wrong. Margaret Reed was 66 years old by that December, a small woman with careful posture and gray hair pulled back from a face that had been holding itself together for a very long time. She came in with a lawyer. She sat down. She folded her hands on the table. Torres laid the DNA results in front of her. Margaret looked at them for a long moment. Then she looked up, and Torres saw something she had not fully anticipated. Not defiance, not denial. What she saw looked like relief, the look of a person who has been carrying something extremely heavy for a very long time and has finally been told they can put it down. Margaret did not make Torres work for it. She said, quietly, I knew this day would come. I think I always knew." And then she told Torres everything. Emily had died at 11:40 in the evening on August 24, 1992, in a hospital room in Hattiesburg. Margaret had been with her through all of it, through the months of treatment and the hope and the collapse of the hope and the long, terrible end. Emily had been 4 years old. She had been, Margaret said, everything. When she died, something foundational in Margaret died with her. The hospital was already in hurricane mode. Staff were moving, generators were cycling, and Margaret was alone in a room with her dead child and a storm bearing down and no idea what to do next. Someone came eventually and guided her into a hallway and then outside, and then she was at a shelter, and she remembered very little of the specific sequence because the grief had compressed everything into something non-linear and unreliable. She found Grace at the shelter. The child was standing near the entrance, alone in a building full of adults too consumed by their own catastrophes to pay sufficient attention to one small girl standing near the door. Small and dark-haired and 4 years old and completely alone. Margaret took her hand. The child did not pull away. The child gripped back with the fierce grip of a small person who is terrified and has found something solid. Margaret told herself she would find the child's family. She told herself she would make inquiries. She told herself these things over the days that followed, and she did none of them. And she told Torres that she knew, even as she was saying them, that she was not going to. The grief had reached in and rearranged something essential. This child needed a mother. Margaret needed a child, and the storm had already destroyed the old life so thoroughly that the new one, small and frightened at her side, felt less like a choice and more like what was left. She used Emily's documents. She told anyone who asked that the girl was her daughter, that the documents had been damaged in the flood. In the immediate aftermath of a major hurricane, in a region where record-keeping itself was a casualty of the disaster, that story held. She was able to move, to relocate, to build the paper trail that would become Caitlin Margaret Reed. She did not use Emily's first name. That was the one line she would not cross. Calling this living child by her dead daughter's name every day felt like something she could not survive. She chose Caitlin, a name that belonged to no ghost. She used Emily's birth date because it was the only matching date she had. She used the surname, but the name Caitlin was new, chosen because she had always liked it, and that small distinction was apparently the place where Margaret drew the moral line she could live behind. Torres asked, "Did Caitlin ever ask about her past?" Margaret was quiet. Then she said, "Children who are very young don't always ask the questions you expect. I answered what she asked. I just didn't offer what she didn't." Torres asked, "And as she got older?" Margaret said, "I told her we had moved a lot. I told her records got lost. I told her the flood had damaged things. She was a child who trusted the adult who raised her. I was that adult." It was, Torres would say later, one of the more disturbing and more human things she had heard in an interview room. The mechanics were not complicated. A child trusts a caregiver. A caregiver shapes what the child knows. The shaping is not violence. It is not cruelty. It is, in its own terrible way, done by someone who genuinely loves the child, which was exactly what made it so hard to hold in one frame. Margaret was formally charged on December 23, 2004. Kidnapping in the first degree under Alabama statute. Additional charges related to identity fraud and the falsification of documents. Her lawyer entered a not guilty plea at the arraignment, which was expected.
The real proceedings would take considerably longer. Claire was informed of the charges the same day. Torres also told her that Caitlin, placed temporarily with a certified foster family while the legal proceedings were ongoing, had been told the essential truth by a child services counselor. Not all of it, not the full weight of it, but the core fact that a DNA test had confirmed a biological connection to another woman, and that Margaret had been charged with a crime related to how Caitlin had come to be in her care. Torres said, "She's processing it. She has a counselor with her." Claire asked, "Does she know about me?" Torres said, "She knows there's a biological mother. She doesn't know you live in the same building yet." Claire said, "How do I do this right?" Torres said, "You go slow. You let the counselors lead. You make it clear you are there and that you are not going to make demands she isn't ready for." Claire spent Christmas of 2004 alone in her apartment 3 floors above an empty unit. She sat at her kitchen table and thought about 12 years of looking. She thought about a 4-year-old girl in a flooded hallway reaching back for a hand that wasn't there. She thought about an elevator, about a teenager's quiet voice counting backwards. She thought about what it would mean to meet her daughter for the first time when her daughter was 16 and had no memory of her at all. The first meeting was arranged on January 11, 2005, in a neutral room at the Child Services Office. Soft chairs, warm lighting, a counselor present throughout. Claire arrived early and sat in the parking lot for a long time before going in. The counselor had told her, "Don't expect recognition. Don't expect emotion on her side that matches what you're feeling. She has no memory of you. Your job today is simply to be a person she is not afraid of." Claire walked in and sat down. A few minutes later, the door opened. Grace Bennett walked in. She was taller than Claire had pictured. She moved the way teenagers do when they're trying to look less frightened than they are, that studied casualness that doesn't quite work because the body tells the truth even when the face cooperates. Brown eyes. She sat down across from Claire and looked at her with an expression Claire could only describe as assessment, the look of someone trying to take a measurement without yet having the right tools. The counselor introduced them. She used both names. Caitlin said, "Hi." Claire said, "Hi." A silence. The counselor let it breathe. Then the girl said, quietly, "The counting thing. They told me about the counting thing, about why you think it was me." Claire nodded. She said, "I've done that my whole life. Margaret told me it helped with anxiety. I thought she made it up." Claire said softly, "I made it up. In a clinic when you were 3. You were scared of a shot." The girl was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a strange thing to carry across all those years." Claire said, "You have no idea." Something shifted in the room, small and unmeasurable, but real. It was not a reunion the way movies depict reunions, no collapse of tears, no instant restoration of everything lost. It was quieter than that, and more tentative, and more honest. 2 people at the beginning of something that had no roadmap and no instructions, something that would take years to understand. But it was a beginning. Margaret Reed's trial began in September of 2005, 9 months after the charges were filed. The story had made its way into the regional press by January, and by the time the trial started, it carried the kind of weight that resists easy framing. Because this case was genuinely hard to categorize, and the courtroom felt it. The prosecution was legally straightforward. A child had been taken. Documents had been falsified. A woman had raised a child under a stolen identity for 12 years. The law had no category for grief as mitigation in a kidnapping charge, and the prosecutor made this point clearly and without drama. The defense was emotionally complicated. Margaret's attorney presented the full picture of August 1992, Emily's death, the timing, the chaos of the hurricane, the shelter, and the small child alone near the door. He presented testimony from a psychologist describing acute, grief-induced dissociation and its documented capacity to compromise moral reasoning. He argued that Margaret had not acted from predatory intent. He argued that the situation had arisen from a collision of tragedy and catastrophe and a woman's inability, in a single critical moment, to choose correctly. He also argued that the girl herself had testified to the quality of care she received. Caitlin did testify. It was entirely her choice. The counselors had made clear she was not required to. She chose to anyway. She was 17 by the time she took the stand. She had been living with Claire for several months by then, a tentative and careful arrangement both of them were navigating with the help of a family therapist and a great deal of patience. She sat in the witness box in a pale blue sweater and answered questions with the precision of someone who had thought very carefully about what she wanted to say. She said Margaret had loved her. She said this without hesitation. She said, "I know what she did was wrong. I understand she took me from someone I belonged with. I understand the documents were falsified and the life she built for me was constructed on a lie about who I was. I am not saying those things were not wrong. I am saying that inside that wrong thing there was a real person who raised me with genuine care. I can hold both of those things at the same time." The prosecutor asked, "Do you feel you were harmed?" She said, "Something was taken from me that I can't get back. The years with my biological mother, the memory of who I was before I was Caitlin. Those things are gone, and no court can restore them. That is a harm. I'm just not sure what the right word for it is." The jury deliberated for 4 days. On October 14, 2005, they returned a verdict of guilty on the kidnapping charge and guilty on 2 of the 3 identity fraud charges. The third was dismissed on a procedural finding unrelated to the substance of the evidence. Margaret Reed was sentenced on December 2, 2005, 15 years in state custody with the possibility of parole after 10. The judge, in delivering the sentence, acknowledged the unusual circumstances and the genuine complexity of the moral picture, and then stated clearly that what Margaret had done to a mother and a child across 12 years could not be answered with anything less than a substantial period of incarceration. Margaret was taken into custody. She looked, Claire would say later, like someone who had already made peace with it. Claire and Grace attended the sentencing together. They sat in the second row. They were still learning each other, still finding the vocabulary of a relationship that had no reliable model. But they sat close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and when the gavel came down, Claire felt Grace exhale slowly beside her. Neither of them spoke until they were outside, standing in the December light, the courthouse behind them, and the rest of it ahead. Grace said, "Is it over?" Claire said, "The legal part, yes." Grace said, "What's the other part?" Claire said, "Figuring out what comes next." Grace looked out at the street. Then she said, "I think I want to keep the name Grace, legally. I've been thinking about it." Claire said, "It was always yours." Grace said, "I know. I just needed to decide it for myself." That is the thing about this case that resists clean resolution. The verdict answered the question of accountability. The sentence answered the question of consequence. What neither could answer was whether it was possible to give back to a person the years that were taken from them, the thread of a particular relationship,
the continuous experience of a specific life lived with a specific person? The answer is that it is not possible. That thread was cut in a flooded hospital hallway on August 24, 1992, and no verdict and no reunion and no amount of careful therapeutic work could reattach it. What was possible was something different, something less cinematic but more real, the possibility of building a new thread, choosing with full knowledge of everything lost to begin anyway. Grace Bennett chose to begin. She graduated high school in the spring of 2007. Claire was in the front row. There is a photograph from that afternoon that Claire keeps on her mantle. Grace in a cap and gown, Claire beside her, both of them squinting into the sun. Grace is not smiling for the camera. She is smiling for the moment itself, the way people smile when something true and hard-won is actually happening and they know it. In one of the conversations Claire shared in the years that followed, she described something Grace had said a few weeks after moving in. They had been sitting in the kitchen, and Grace had been quiet for a long time, and then she said something Claire wrote down and kept. She said, "I don't know who I would have been if none of this happened. I only know who I am now, and now is what I have. The only way forward is to build from now." There are open questions that will never be fully answered. Whether the emergency systems that were supposed to track displaced children after Andrew could have functioned better in the chaos and caught what happened sooner. Whether Margaret, had she made different choices in those first days, could have found a path through her grief that did not require taking another woman's child. Whether Grace, given everything, has been able to construct a self that belongs entirely to her and not to the years that were stolen. That last question is hers to answer, and she has answered it in the way she has chosen to live, not by assigning herself permanently to the category of victim, not by collapsing the love she acknowledged for Margaret and the loss she acknowledged because of Margaret into a single manageable feeling, but by holding it all and choosing each day to define herself not by what was taken, but by what she is building. There is one more thing. On a morning in the fall of 2007, Claire and Grace were driving somewhere. Claire doesn't remember where, an ordinary errand on an ordinary morning. They stopped at a red light. Somewhere down the block, a car alarm was going off, that anxious wailing you learn to filter out in cities, and Grace reached over and turned the radio down to hear it better, and when it stopped, neither of them spoke. And then Grace started counting, under her breath, barely audible. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Claire kept her hands on the wheel. She looked at the red light and waited. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The light turned green. They drove on. Some things survive everything. Some things cross the full distance between who we were and who we became and arrive intact on the other side, small and private and stubborn, carrying the echo of a moment in a clinic when a child was frightened and a mother found the right words. Some things hold. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to leave a like and share it with someone who might need to hear it. It is the most meaningful thing you can do to help this channel keep bringing you stories told with the care they deserve. And if you are new here, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves.